storm that devours names. Millions of men are lost in its fog of steel and fire, becoming mere numbers, grim statistics of a conflict that swallowed them whole. But very rarely, a name is not lost. It rises. It cuts through the darkness like lightning and inscribes itself in history not as a mere soldier, but as a legend, a force of nature dressed in uniform. In the blood-soaked skies of the Eastern Front, where the greatest air battle in history was fought every day, one of those names loomed above all others. He was not a general in headquarters. He was a 22-year-old ghost, a specter that Soviet pilots whispered to each other before missions. A young German with golden hair and a disarming smile, who hid a predator's mind and a coldness that redefined the limits of aerial combat. His name was Erich Alfred Hartmann, and the numbers that follow him are not just impressive, they defy logic. 352. 352 enemy aircraft shot down in combat. An absolute record not only of the Second World War, but of all time. A feat bordering on the impossible, an epic written with machine gun fire in the sky. But behind this war myth, there was a man. This is the story of his journey, of the boy who learned to dream looking at the clouds, of the soldier who became the personification of fear for his enemies, and of the human being who, in the end, had to carry the unbearable weight of his own legend. This is the story of the rise of the Black Demon.
To understand the myth, we must go back to the beginning, far from the roar of cannons in the quiet town of Weissach in southern Germany. The year is 1922. The Weimar Republic is breathing with difficulty, suffocated by hyperinflation and the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. National pride is in tatters. It is in this wounded world that Erich Hartmann opens his eyes for the first time. His home, however, was a microcosm of contrasts. On one side, his father, Alfred Hartmann, a respected doctor, a man of solid ground, of reason, of healing science. He represented the anchor, the stability in a country adrift. On the other side, his mother, Elizabeth. If Alfred was the anchor, Elizabeth was the wind, a woman of indomitable spirit and rare vision for the time. She was not simply an aviation enthusiast. Elizabeth Hartmann was a licensed pilot, one of the pioneers, a woman who defied gravity and social conventions to run her own flight school. It was in this environment, permeated with the smell of gasoline and oil, that little Erich grew up. At just a few years old, his seat wasn't on the ground, but in the cockpit of his mother's aircraft, a fragile glider or a homemade biplane. While other children learned to run, Erich Hartmann learned to fly. By the age of 14, he was already an experienced glider pilot, his hand firm on the controls, his eyes scanning the horizon with precocious calm. Elizabeth didn't just teach him the mechanics of flight. She passed on her philosophy. The feeling of sovereign freedom above the clouds where earthly worries dissipated. The silent language of the wind hitting the spars, whispering secrets about lift and destiny. The intimate, almost symbiotic trust between pilot and machine. An extension of his own body and will. Erich Hartmann's destiny was not forged in the furnaces of the Nazi war industry. It was sown, with care and love, in the sunny airfields of his childhood, under the ambitious gaze of a mother who saw in the skies not a battlefield, but a realm of infinite possibilities. The boy who learned to see the world from 1,000 feet in the air would never accept the limits of the ground. He was already, in his essence, a being of the skies. And the skies would soon reclaim him, but in a way that neither of them could have imagined. the 1930s brought not just a political storm, they brought a hurricane that rearranged the soul of Germany. Under the Nazi regime, the country rearmed itself with frenetic speed. The Treaty of Versailles was torn up, and the Luftwaffe, the air force that had been dismantled, was reborn from the ashes not as a bird, but as a steel eagle. A call echoed to a generation of young people. German youth would be the new aristocracy of the skies. In 1940, Erich Hartmann, just 18 years old, answered the call. He traded the sunny airfields of his childhood for the gray rigidity of military training camps. Hartmann was, at first glance, a troubled soldier, a free spirit heir to the freedom his mother had taught him. His uniform was sometimes not impeccable, his hair a little too long. He possessed an unpretentious charm and an easy smile that he used as a shield against blind discipline. But when he climbed into the cockpit of a trainer, a transformation occurred. Irreverence gave way to absolute concentration. The instructors, skeptical and hardened men, noticed something that the manuals couldn't teach. While other cadets flew following procedures, Hartmann felt the plane. He possessed an almost organic connection with the machine, a tactile sensitivity that told him exactly how much he could push a wing, the exact angle of a dive. His eyes, trained since childhood to read the horizon, performed an even more valuable feat. He possessed an exceptional big picture. While others concentrated on a single point, Hartmann scanned the skies with methodical calm, identifying distant patches that became enemy planes long before the others. It was a calm under pressure that was not an absence of fear, but rather a total mastery over it, a coldness bordering on detachment. It was in this crucible of training that Hartmann's doctrine began to crystallize. He rejected the dangerous romanticism of aerial duels, the acrobatic dogfight that depleted fuel and lives. His analytical mind forged a four-pillar creed, a deadly symphony of brutal simplicity. See the enemy, decide the tactic, attack with precision, break contact. It was the antithesis of conventional heroism. It was the philosophy of the ambush hunter. It wasn't about bravery, it was about efficiency. An aseptic, lethal, and above all, survival-oriented efficiency. The stage for putting this theory to the test was the most brutal imaginable, the Eastern Front, where war was not combat, but a slaughterhouse of continental dimensions.
October 1942, the Eastern Front, a universe of extremes where the earth was frozen mud and the sky a cathedral of death. It was in this hell that Lieutenant Hartmann, under 20 years old, was sent to the legendary Jagdgeschwader 52. The unit was a pantheon of living heroes, an elite club of assassins where he was an insignificant rookie. His steel horse was the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G2, a formidable, agile machine armed with 20mm cannons. But it was also a demanding and treacherous lady. A belly landing, a sudden maneuver at low speed, and she would turn into a flying coffin. Hartmann needed to tame the beast, and the first lesson was the cruelest. His first combat mission. His heart pounding in his chest like a hammer, cold sweat under his leather helmet. Then he saw them. A formation of robust Soviet IL-2 Sturmovit ground attack aircraft, nicknamed flying tanks. Adrenaline, a green poison in his veins, clouded his judgment. All the training, all the philosophy of see and decide evaporated. He ignored his leader's command. With tunnel vision, he dove alone like an anxious hawk. In the chaos, he lost all sense of position, altitude, tactics. And then, the inevitable. A blinding flash, a violent impact that shook the fuselage. The sound of metal being shredded. But it was not the attack from a Soviet fighter. It came from the ground. German anti-aircraft artillery, mistaking his desperate dive for an enemy aircraft, targeted its own man. What followed was not heroic. It was humiliating. A forced and disastrous landing in a muddy field. The future greatest ace of aviation, the Black Devil, stood unharmed and ashamed beside the smoking wreckage of his Messerschmitt without even having pressed the firing button. The return to base was an ordeal. The mockery from his veteran colleagues was harsh. He had wasted an expensive plane, disobeyed direct orders, and failed spectacularly. The punishment was severe: humiliating service and the label of problem pilot. But in that unit of aces, one man saw beyond the failure. Walter Krupinski, a daring and respected ace nicknamed Graf Punsky, saw not just a mistake. He saw a reflection of his own aggressive nature. He saw in Hartmann's rash dive not cowardice or incompetence, but a raw and unpolished fighting impulse. Krupinski took him under his wing. The lesson Krupinski imparted wasn't in any manual. War isn't about never falling. It's about learning to get back up after a fall. Hartmann had fallen the lowest possible way. Now it was up to him to use that humiliation as the foundation upon which he would build his legend. The boy had died in that muddy field. The warrior was about to be born.
Humiliation didn't break Erich Hartmann. It forged him. He became a silent, obsessive student, a sponge for the lethal knowledge of the veteran aces of JG-52. His salvation came in the form of Walter Graf Krupinski, a pilot whose philosophy was attack first, ask questions later. Krupinski didn't teach him to be cautious. He taught him to channel his raw aggression with the precision of a surgeon. Hartmann spent his nights drawing combat schemes, debating dive angles, internalizing each piece of advice like a commandment. And then, on November 5, 1942, over the Caucasus, came the moment of truth. The radio screamed with overwhelmed voices. A formation of IL-2 Sturmovix, the Soviet flying tanks, armored and deadly, appeared on the horizon. This time, there was no rash dive. Hartmann, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with concentration, applied the lesson. He positioned himself, waited, and chose his target. The first shot was a trail of fire that struck the heavy attack aircraft. It was his first victory. But the triumph was almost a tragedy. Blinded by the emotion of the moment, he flew dangerously close to the explosive wreckage of the IL-2, damaging the wing of his own Bf-109 with the debris. He barely managed to return to base, his plane as damaged as the one from his first disastrous mission. The lesson was cruel, but definitive. Courage without control was suicide. True mastery lay not in shooting, but in surviving after the kill. It was at this moment that Hartmann's final technique crystallized in its purest and most terrifying form. He began to approach the enemy at a distance that others considered insane, less than 50 meters. Sometimes so close that he could see the enemy plane's insignia, the pilot's face. He forced himself to hold his breath to keep his muscles relaxed. He only fired when the enemy aircraft completely filled his Revue display, blocking the sky. It was a deadly psychological game, a duel of nerves of steel where the reward for blinking was annihilation. The psychology extended to his machine. The black lotus flower on his cowling, a personal symbol, was mistaken from a distance for a black and sinister heart.
Later came the emblematic design of a shark's mouth with sharp teeth and deadly eyes. It wasn't just a decoration, it was a weapon. It was a symbol designed to be recognized too late, to instill a spike of fear and hesitation in the opponent in the critical second preceding the attack. Soviet intelligence reports began to mention a phantom, a diabolical pilot who attacked out of nowhere. They christened him Cherny Chort, the Black Demon of Ukraine. The legend was not created by German propaganda. It was born from genuine terror on the enemy's side.
Thus, Hartmann became less of a pilot and more of a force of nature, a combat machine of almost inhuman efficiency. His sorties transformed into a methodical and repetitive ritual of death. On August 7, 1943, during the Battle of Kursk, the peak of armored combat in history, he demonstrated his coldness by shooting down 7 planes in a single day. Each mission was a repetition of his murderous creed. His process was infallible. He and his wingmen would climb, seeking the absolute advantage, the head-on collision. They would position themselves between the sun and the enemy, becoming practically invisible against the blinding glare. They waited, patient, like spiders in the center of a cosmic web. Hartmann scanned the sky below, his exceptional vision pinpointing the points, the enemy planes that, for him, had shed their humanity, becoming merely targets on a tactical diagram. Then, the dive. A calculated angle, not an impulsive descent. Silent approach, engines at cruising speed to avoid the smoke trail that would betray a powerful dive. Closer, closer, until the enemy fuselage filled his world. Then, the brief and devastating sound of his Mk-108 cannons. A short, economical burst, often less than a second long. They were surgical shots, point blank, that disintegrated cockpits and shattered wings. Immediately after the shot, without a fraction of a second to confirm the fall, came the most important maneuver of all, breaking contact. A sudden flick, a nose-down dive to gain speed and disappear from the combat zone before any covering fighter knew what had happened. He never, ever stayed to watch the wreckage fall. He was an assassin who did not revel in death, only administered it. The count climbed. 50, 100, 150, 200. Each marking painted on the tail of his plane was a trophy, but also a burden. For Hartmann, the war had become desensitized. It had become a job, a dangerous, dirty job, but a job nonetheless, where his productivity was measured in lives ended. He wasn't a sadistic monster, he was a craftsman of death, a specialist whose expertise was so terrifying that it transcended the comprehension of the average soldier. He was Employee of the Month every month in a company whose end product was eternal silence.
In the autumn of 1944, Erich Hartmann had ascended to an unattainable level. With over 300 victories, he was the greatest ace of all time. A national hero, his picture was plastered across newspapers and magazines in Germany. For the Soviets, he was a tangible ghost, a curse that hung over the skies of Ukraine. But glory is a currency that is quickly spent in war. And the sky he had so dominated was beginning to crumble. Nazi Germany was in agony, a giant bleeding on 1,000 fronts. The Soviet war machine, now an unstoppable avalanche, was advancing. Hartmann, who for years had been the hunter, tasted the bitter flavor of the chase. He was forced to land behind enemy lines not once, but 7 times, escaping capture through sheer audacity and luck. With each return to base, the list of dead friends and comrades grew. The young man with the easy smile now carried the weight of hundreds of deaths on his shoulders and the pain of loss in his heart. The skies, once his realm of freedom, had become a trap. Each mission was a journey to a hell he himself had helped to create. The Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds that he received was no longer a symbol of honor, but a heavy burden of expectations in a crumbling country. The reckoning for his lethal efficiency was about to be presented. The man who had defied death 352 times now witnessed his own nation, his cause, and his world dying at his feet. Then, the inevitable question arises, more terrifying than any enemy fighter. What remains of a god of war when the war ends? What happens to a demon when the skies, his only domain, falls silent forever? The legend of Erich Hartmann, forged in fire and steel, was about to enter its darkest, cruelest, and most profoundly human chapter. In the next part, the final fall, the surrender, and the beginning of an ordeal that would test not his ability to fly, but his will to live. The long and brutal years in the dungeons of the Soviet Gulag, where the greatest flying ace would learn firsthand that the hardest battle was not fought in the skies, but in the depths of the human soul. And that freedom is the ultimate and most precious victory.